December 17, 1944. 800 hours. The town of Bullingen lay frozen under a gray Belgian sky. In the center square, American prisoners of war stood among the wreckage of their own army, sleeves rolled up, faces pale in the cold. They were pumping gasoline, American gasoline, into German tanks. SS Oberfuhrer Joachim Peiper watched silently from the edge of the square. Around him, the black crosses of the 1st SS Panzer Division filled the streets. Tanks, half-tracks, armored cars, all marked with frost and soot. Every engine waited for the same thing, fuel. The men worked quickly, under rifles pointed at their backs. Metal cans clanged against steel armor, the smell of gasoline mixing with winter air and burning rubber. The irony was cruel and efficient. American fuel, American cans, American prisoners keeping the German offensive alive. Peiper's orders were simple on paper. Punch through the American lines. Race west. Reach the Meuse River. Seize the bridges before the Allies could destroy them. If he succeeded, the German army would split the Allied front in two. British and Canadian forces cut off from the Americans. The code name was Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last gamble, the largest German attack in the West since 1940.
To the Meuse Bridge, sir.
3 armies.
We push the armor through tonight.
250,000 men. 400 tanks and assault guns. And one fatal weakness, fuel. The numbers were absurd from the beginning. 5 million gallons allocated for the entire offensive. The planners knew it wasn't enough. To reach Antwerp, they needed twice that. Their solution was desperate and naive. Capture American fuel depots. The map Peiper carried listed every target, supply points, ammunition dumps, gasoline stores. The intelligence was accurate. The optimism was not. Now, in Bullingen, Peiper's men had found one of those depots intact, 50,000 gallons, untouched. Enough to refuel his entire spearhead, at least for the next dash west. It was a victory measured in gasoline, not ground. The prisoners worked in silence. Each jerry can held 5 gallons. 10 cans per tank. 100 tanks to fill. Peiper did the math in his head. 5,000 gallons for a full column. It would take hours. Hours he didn't have. Every minute spent refueling was a minute the Americans could use to reorganize, to fight back. But without fuel, his Panzer spearhead was nothing more than cold steel, expensive statues on tracks. He had seen that lesson written in fire on the Eastern Front, when entire divisions froze in place because the fuel convoys never arrived. Standing there, watching gasoline splash into captured machines, Peiper understood the paradox of his mission. He could fight, maneuver, win skirmishes, but only as long as the tanks moved. And the tanks only moved as long as they drank American gas. The fate of his elite armored column, named Kampfgruppe Peiper, depended not on courage or tactics, but on logistics, the invisible heartbeat of modern war. A young officer, Luska, approached through the cold. Fuel won't last past Stavelot, he reported quietly. Peiper nodded.
Hold on, buddy.
He already knew.
We need help, Doc.
The next depot was marked just north of the Amblève River, larger than this one.
Left.
They would reach it by noon, if the roads held. He glanced around the captured depot, rows of neatly stacked crates, ammunition, rations, winter uniforms, medical kits. Everything labeled, everything organized.
We will
He picked
never
up a
surrender.
small cardboard box, stamped K-Ration, meal, combat, individual, breakfast unit.
We must withdraw.
Inside were ham and eggs, biscuits, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, even a small packet of chewing gum. A meal for one soldier, sealed and waterproof, manufactured 2 months earlier, October 1944. The Americans were feeding their army from factories thousands of miles away, packaging 3 meals a day for millions of men. Germany could barely feed its front lines. Peiper said nothing. He held the box in his hand, like a message from another world, a world of industrial abundance. If this was how the enemy ate, how could Germany hope to win? The sound of engines interrupted his thoughts. The first refueled tanks were ready to move. He gave the order to form the march column. The road west awaited, mud, ice, wreckage, and the promise of another depot. Another chance. Behind him, the prisoners kept working, their breath white in the cold.
Stand back, one last time.
Gasoline splashed, the air burned with fumes. The German column began to roll. For a moment, Peiper turned back toward the square. The American prisoners stood beside the empty fuel drums. They had watched their own fuel flow into the tanks that would soon hunt their comrades. It was an image of modern war, mechanical, efficient, merciless. And somewhere in that moment hung the question that would decide everything. How far can an army go when its fuel comes from the enemy? By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe was supposed to be over. At least, that's what most American soldiers believed. Paris had been liberated in August. The Allies stood at Germany's western frontier. Hitler's armies were retreating on every front. The newspapers back home were already printing headlines about the last Christmas of the war. But in the forests of the Ardennes, the German army was preparing one last counterstroke. The plan came from Hitler himself. He called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The name sounded defensive, even poetic, but the intent was anything but. It was an offensive of desperation, to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that might still save Germany from total defeat. 3 armies would strike through the snow-covered hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. The 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich on the north flank, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel in the center, and the 7th Army to guard the southern shoulder. Together, they counted 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns. On paper, it was formidable. In reality, it was held together by wishful thinking and gasoline fumes. The last gamble, the German High Command called it a blitzkrieg without fuel. They knew the numbers didn't add up. 5 million gallons of gasoline were allocated for the entire offensive, barely enough to drive the armored divisions halfway to their objectives. Basic arithmetic showed the plan was impossible. But Hitler's staff no longer argued. The solution, he insisted, was simple. Capture American fuel depots. Take what you need. Keep moving. It was a gambler's logic. Win by stealing the other player's chips before he notices. And it placed an impossible burden on men like Joachim Peiper, whose armored column was the sharpest spear point of the attack. Peiper was 30 years old, a career SS officer who had risen fast through charisma, ruthlessness, and competence. His unit, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal guard turned elite assault force. It was powerful on paper. 4,800 men, 117 tanks and assault guns, and dozens of support vehicles.
Best meal I've had all week, even if my mustache is frozen solid.
It was a fragile machine dependent on captured American fuel and good luck.
You might chip a tooth on that
the
gravy.
state of the Reich.
Faster, driver.
By late 1944, the German war economy was collapsing.
I'm going as fast as I
Strategic
can,
bombing had reduced factories to rubble. Rail lines were craters. Bridges lay in rivers. Even the most loyal officers knew the truth. Germany could no longer sustain modern warfare. On the Eastern Front, entire divisions were being destroyed by the Red Army's relentless advance. In the West, the Allies had overwhelming superiority in the air.
And keep your eyes peeled.
Every daylight movement risked annihilation from P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers.
We have to move faster.
Convoys burned on the roads before they ever reached the front.
We secure the spans
to save
here,
fuel,
or the offensive
tanks were
fails.
moved by night. Engines cut the moment they stopped.
Next round,
Every drop of gasoline mattered. Every shell, every ration, every tire. By December, the Wehrmacht was fighting on empty. And yet, inside Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, and later the Eagle's Nest, the fantasy of reversal persisted. He believed a successful counteroffensive in the West could shatter Allied morale, perhaps even drive the Americans out of Europe. It was not strategy. It was denial with the battle plan. The plan that shouldn't have worked, the Ardennes, was chosen for a reason. Thick forests, narrow roads, limited visibility. Ideal for a surprise attack, terrible for logistics.
Fire mission,
in E40,
grid 29
Germany had
Yankee.
used the same terrain to break France.
Drop 200.
In 1904,
then high
Hitler hoped to
explosive,
repeat the
over.
miracle in reverse.
Dieses Brot
But
ist das
miracles
Leben
require
selbst.
fuel. And this time,
Ich hab
the
seit
tanks
Wochen
would have to
nichts
refuel
Warmes mehr
themselves.
gegessen.
Vorsicht, es ist
Peiper's
heiß.
orders placed him at the tip of the spear. His objective? Capture the crossings at the Meuse River near Liège, then push toward Antwerp. Distance? Roughly
Wait for the
120
lead
miles.
tank. Don't fire early.
Fuel on
Got
hand,
it.
enough for 90.
Waiting.
The difference would have to come from captured American depots. He studied the intelligence maps before the attack,
Gib's mir.
neatly marked with symbols for fuel, ammo, supplies.
Beeilung. Weiter,
The
weiter.
American army, according to German intelligence, had left its rear areas fat and complacent. There would be plenty to take. It was a tempting illusion. A machine without oil logistics, the unromantic science of keeping soldiers fed, armed, and moving, was the invisible war behind every battle. In 1944, that invisible war had already been lost by Germany. The numbers told the story better than speeches. In 1930, Germany produced roughly 8 million tons of oil. By 1944, Allied bombing and loss of Romanian fields had cut that to less than half. Synthetic fuel plants struggled to keep up. Trains carried barrels instead of bombs. Some armored divisions received less than 1/3 of their required allocations. Peiper had watched entire tank regiments on the Eastern Front die standing still, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. He called them steel graves without crosses. Now, he faced the same fate in Belgium, unless he could refuel from the enemy. That paradox haunted every order he gave. To advance, he had to stop. To fight, he had to capture supplies first. Time was his enemy, as much as the Americans were.
When can we move out?
A calculated illusion. At dawn on December 16th, the offensive began under a curtain of fog. German artillery thundered across the front, smashing American positions along a 70-mile sector. Infantry advanced through the woods. Tanks followed narrow roads, already clogged with horse-drawn wagons and refugees. The initial surprise worked. American lines bent and broke in several places. Within 20 hours, Peiper's armored columns were deep inside Allied territory, racing west, straight toward Bullingen, and toward the first real test of the plan.
Lift it higher,
Behind
lads.
every engine roar
Watch
lay
the
a silent
wires.
truth.
Keep it steady
The
now.
German army was fighting with the last of its fuel, the last of its reserves, the last of its hope. Every gallon burned was a gamble. Every captured depot was a heartbeat bought on credit. In the command vehicles, maps spread across hoods. Officers traced routes with trembling pencils. One wrong turn, one destroyed bridge, one empty fuel dump, and the entire offensive could freeze in place. But the orders were clear. Keep moving. Take the bridges! Reach the Meuse. It was the arithmetic of desperation. For every gallon burned, Peiper's staff calculated the remaining distance. 5 miles per gallon on rough terrain. Each tank carried 200 gallons. 100 tanks. That meant 20,000 gallons for every 100 miles. Multiply by 3 Panzer armies, and the numbers became impossible.
The map clearly
Mathematics,
indicates this
not
route.
courage,
This sign
defined the
must be
limits of
vandalized.
this
Sir,
offensive.
trust me, the main
When the
road
fuel
is that
columns
way.
stalled,
We're
the
wasting
war
time.
stalled with them. And so Peiper's men learned to count differently, not by miles or objectives, but by the number of jerry cans left in the convoy. Each can was worth a few more minutes of movement, a few more heartbeats of war. So, by the time the German spearhead reached the outskirts of Bullingen on December 17th, the offensive was less than 30 hours old, and already the tanks were running dry. What happened next? The captured American depot, the prisoners forced to refuel their captors, the missed opportunity at Stavelot, was not just a story about one unit. It was the story of an entire nation fighting beyond the limits of its own endurance. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest engagement on the Western Front, a struggle not only of armies, but of systems. On one side, a modern industrial power with supply lines stretching from Pennsylvania to the Ardennes. On the other, a nation running on fumes, hoping that courage could replace gasoline. In the end, it wasn't courage that failed. It was arithmetic. Morning light was thin and gray as Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled out of Bullingen. Engines coughed black smoke into the frozen air. Tanks led the way, half-tracks followed, supply trucks crept behind. It was a column of steel stretching for miles through narrow Belgian roads, slick with ice and mud. Behind them, Bullingen lay silent, American prisoners guarded, the fuel depot empty. Ahead lay Stavelot, and beyond it, the Meuse River. 14 kilometers of twisting roads, small villages, stone
It's all
bridges,
right, we'll take
and
care
American
of you.
resistance.
Nice and slow
For
now.
Peiper, the next
You're very
depot at
brave.
Stavelot meant everything. Without it, his tanks would not see another sunrise. Into Stavelot. By noon, December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached the Meuse River valley. Stavelot sat nestled between hills, bisected by the river, a stone bridge at its heart. American engineers had prepared the bridge for demolition, but waited too long.
Halt durch, Kamerad.
Peiper's leading tanks caught them still wiring the charges. The Germans attacked without hesitation. Panthers fired point blank into American positions. Infantry rushed forward through smoke and snow.
plan.
For 3 hours, the town shook under machine gun fire and artillery bursts. At last, the bridge stood intact, the defenders driven back across the water. Peiper's engineers swarmed over the structure, cutting wires, disarming charges that never detonated. It was luck, rare and precious.
Meine Hände sind taub.
When the dust settled, Stavelot was theirs,
Da ist es.
or so it seemed.
Endlich.
The Americans had fallen back, regrouping on the hills to the south. Peiper's men began to search for the one thing they needed
Adjust
most,
fire, right
the
200.
fuel depot.
Repeat, right 200.
The search. According to the intelligence maps, the depot was near Stavelot, a vague promise drawn in pencil weeks before. Peiper
Secure
assumed
that
it would
link
look
now,
like
we're
every other
burning
fuel
daylight.
depot he had seen.
Watch the tension,
Large
make
tanks,
sure it's tight.
trucks, guard posts, visible infrastructure. It should be obvious. He sent recon teams north, south, and west, instructing them to search every road and building. Hours passed. Nothing. They found scattered fuel cans, a few hundred gallons at most, not the massive stockpile they expected. By 1500 hours, frustration filled the air like exhaust fumes. The map said the depot existed. Reality said otherwise. Peiper made the decision to move on. He couldn't afford to linger. Every hour spent searching was an hour of fuel burned standing still. He ordered the column forward, northwest toward Trois Ponts and Stoumont. The tanks roared to life once more, treads crushing snow and asphalt alike. Behind them, the town still smoked. The bridge, miraculously intact, marked both victory and the start of failure. What they never saw. The truth lay just a few hundred yards away. North of the road, Peiper used to approach Stavelot. Along a 5-mile stretch, sat one of the largest American fuel depots in Europe. 3,200,000 gallons of gasoline, stored in 5-gallon jerry cans, stacked shoulder high along the roadside, open to the winter sky. No fences. No buildings. No guards. Just endless rows of fuel cans glinting faintly under frost. It was depot number 2 and now 3 of the 7th 3rd Quartermaster Battalion. Peiper's entire column had driven past it. He had expected steel tanks, not tin cans. He had looked for order, not improvisation. He had searched for a depot that looked German. The American version was invisible precisely because it was simple. Portable, decentralized, unguarded. Fuel is logistics, not as architecture. That difference in thinking, organization versus flexibility, was the quiet hinge of the war. A missed miracle. Had Peiper recognized what he was seeing, the consequences could have been enormous. 3 million gallons would have refueled not only his own Kampfgruppe multiple times, but also other SS Panzer formations struggling behind him. He could have reached the Meuse. He could have kept the offensive alive for days, maybe weeks. Instead, he passed within 300 yards of salvation and never saw it. Later, American engineers re-entered Stavelot after the Germans withdrew. They found the depot untouched, still stacked with thousands of cans, frozen but full. They could hardly believe it themselves. How could the most feared armored unit of the Waffen-SS simply drive past that much fuel? The answer was both simple and tragic. Peiper was a soldier, not a logistician. His training, his instincts, his entire worldview came from a military system that treated logistics as background noise. Fuel depots were supposed to look like depots. Supplies came from above, not from improvisation. That mindset, born from decades of central planning and discipline, blinded him to what was right beside the road. Consequences in motion. As the column rolled westward, fuel gauges sank lower. Some tanks carried only half their normal load. Support vehicles began to fall behind. The roads grew worse, clogged with wrecked trucks, civilian carts, and burning vehicles. American artillery began ranging in from the hills. By the time Peiper reached Stoumont on December 19th, his spearhead had stretched thin, its rear units losing contact. The offensive that had begun with thunder was now running on fumes. Every tank that stopped to refuel risked being stranded. Every delay turned steel advantage into dead weight. By nightfall, the great armored column that had once terrified the Allies had become a snake, starving on its own tail. The invisible enemy fuel was not the only thing running out. Ammunition, rations, even medical supplies dwindled by the hour. The men were cold, hungry, exhausted. They wore captured American gloves and jackets, scavenged from overrun positions. At night, they slept inside abandoned farmhouses or under their tanks, engines idling just long enough to keep frostbite at bay. Peiper's radio operators intercepted fragments of American transmissions, fresh divisions moving in, reinforcements closing from the north and south. The window of surprise was closing. Without fuel, there would be no way out. Still, he pressed forward. Orders were orders. The Meuse lay ahead, and pride drove him as much as duty. The myth of invincibility was all that remained of the Waffen-SS. After the war months later, in an American interrogation room, Peiper would be shown a map. An officer pointed to the exact location of the Stavelot depots. 3 million gallons, the interrogator said. 800 feet from your route. Peiper studied the map, silent for a long moment. Then he smiled faintly and said in English, "I'm sorry." He wasn't being sarcastic. It was the weary apology of a man who had already accepted that history had turned on something as small as a missed side road. The symbolism of a missed depot. The lost fuel at Stavelot became more than a tactical footnote. It symbolized the failure of the entire German war effort. An army that once moved with clockwork precision was now blind to its own weaknesses. The same rigidity that had built its early victories now doomed it to defeat. German logistics demanded perfection. American logistics thrived on adaptation. When one system broke down, the other improvised. That difference decided more than any single battle. In the official reports written after the war, American historians called it a decisive moment of unintended mercy. Because had Peiper found the depot, the battle might have lasted longer, the cost in lives far higher. But history does not run on if. It runs on what happened and what was missed. The road to Stoumont. By December 20th, the German spearhead had lost its momentum. Fuel trucks never arrived. The last reserves were being siphoned from wrecked vehicles. Peiper's men began abandoning half-tracks and trucks, saving fuel for the Panthers and Tigers that still ran. Each remaining tank became both sword and burden. Stoumont awaited, a small village, stone houses, and another bridge that had to be held. Beyond it, the dream of reaching the Meuse was already dying. But that is where Peiper's men would make their final stand, surrounded by the enemy, out of fuel, out of time, and still refusing to surrender. The road to Stavelot had been paved with gasoline. The road from Stavelot would be paved with ashes. In the end, they didn't lose the battle because they lacked courage. They lost because they drove past 3 million gallons of hope and never saw it. December 21st, 1944. The snow had turned gray with soot and blood around the small Belgian village of Stoumont. For 3 days, the battle had raged like a storm trapped between the hills. Now, silence pressed against the frozen ruins, an uneasy pause before collapse. Inside a cellar beneath a shattered house, Major Hal McCown of the U. 30th Infantry Division listened to the rumble of German tanks closing in. His battalion had been fighting Peiper's spearhead since the 18th, holding one crossroads after another until they were cut off completely. Now, surrounded and out of contact with division headquarters, McCown and his men waited for the inevitable. The sound came first, a deep mechanical growl echoing through the valley. Then the sharper rattle of machine guns. The walls trembled. At 14:30 hours, German infantry stormed the building. A short firefight followed, minutes of chaos, 1 American killed, several wounded. When it was over, McCown was a prisoner. Captive. Among professionals, he was taken to Peiper's command post, a stone farmhouse on the edge of Stoumont, pocked with bullet holes, its windows shattered. Inside, German officers bent over maps under the light of guttering candles. Outside, engines idled until the last drops of fuel were gone. Peiper stood near a table, tall and composed despite the exhaustion etched into his face. He greeted McCown politely, almost formally. They were about the same age, both battalion commanders, both professional soldiers in an inhuman war. That night they talked. 7 hours, from 11 until dawn. Peiper did most of the speaking. He defended Germany, explained Nazism as a defense against chaos, justified the offensive as a last effort to save Europe from Bolshevism. McCown listened. He didn't argue. There was no point. He simply observed. The voice, the tone, the conviction of a man still believing in victory, even as his world collapsed around him. Years later, McCown would tell interrogators that he had rarely met anyone so intelligent, so articulate, so doomed. A soldier's eye. During his captivity, McCown watched everything. He made mental notes, the food, the uniforms, the medical stations, the discipline of the men. He saw a German army running on fragments, tired, hungry, still orderly, but held together by habit more than hope. Many soldiers wore parts of American uniforms, gloves, knit caps, even field jackets taken from overrun positions. Not trophies, but survival gear. Their own supply system could not provide winter clothing. Some men wrapped rags around their boots to keep out the snow. When the first food ration arrived, McCown was stunned. The Germans opened captured American boxes, K-Rations and C-Rations, as if they were treasure chests. They studied the contents with childlike curiosity. Chocolate bars, real coffee, cigarettes, small packets of sugar. To American soldiers, these were ordinary. To Germans, they were luxury. One sergeant showed McCown a can of ham from a K-ration and said in rough English, "Better than anything the Wehrmacht gives us." He smiled, a tired, resigned smile, and ate it cold from the can. For a moment, the war felt distant, as if hunger had briefly united enemies in the simplest human truth. Food is survival. The hospital without medicine. A few days later, McCown was allowed to see the field aid station. He would never forget it. Inside a barn, wounded men lay on straw, their faces gray from pain and cold. There was no morphine. No sulfur powder to fight infection. Bandages were reused, washed in buckets of icy water. A doctor worked silently, hands trembling with exhaustion. When amputations were necessary, soldiers held down their comrades, forcing leather straps between their teeth to muffle screams. It was medicine from another century, not from the industrial empire Germany had once claimed to be. McCown thought of the American aid stations he had known. Clean, stocked, efficient, with nurses, plasma, and penicillin. The contrast was staggering. The difference was not in compassion, but in capacity. The Germans cared, but they had nothing left to give. He realized then that this was the true face of defeat. Not just losing ground, but losing the means to take care of your own. The failed resupply. On December 22nd, the Luftwaffe attempted an aerial drop for Peiper's trapped force. 6 planes came in low through the snow, parachutes blossoming behind them. The men watched with desperate hope as the canisters fell. Most missed. Wind and poor navigation carried the supplies straight into American lines. German soldiers could see them, bright parachutes fluttering 200 yards away, in territory they could not reach. The drop was a cruel joke, salvation delivered out of range. Peiper's men laughed bitterly. Some cursed. Others just stared. There would be no more fuel, no more ammunition, no more food. Their world was shrinking by the hour. The decision. By December 23rd, the situation was hopeless. The Kampfgruppe was surrounded. 800 men, dozens of vehicles, 170 American prisoners, hundreds of wounded. No fuel to move the tanks, no ammunition to defend them. The snow muffled everything except the sound of engines dying for the last time. Peiper gathered his officers in the ruined farmhouse. Maps covered the table, lit by the dull glow of lanterns. They discussed options: fight to the last, surrender, or break out on foot. None were good. Peiper chose the only one that preserved any chance of survival. Abandon the vehicles, destroy what couldn't be carried, release the prisoners, and march east through the forest to reach German lines. It was not surrender. It was retreat by necessity. McCown listened quietly as the Germans planned their escape. There was no bravado, no drama, just cold professionalism. Even trapped, they behaved like soldiers following procedure. He felt an unexpected respect for them. War, he realized, wasn't always about hate. Sometimes it was about endurance. The march. At 2 a.m. on Christmas Eve, they moved. 800 men walking single file through snow and darkness, their boots crunching softly, rifles slung, breath steaming in the air. They carried what they could: machine guns, ammunition, a few rations, and memories of the tanks they had left behind. McCown used the confusion to slip away. He reached American lines on Christmas Day, frostbitten and hollow-eyed, but alive. He filed his report immediately, clear, factual, precise. He described the German conditions, their discipline, their desperation. He said they had treated him correctly under the Geneva Convention. He spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and a strange professionalism that persisted even as everything else collapsed. The human paradox. Peiper's men had fought well, courageously, sometimes brutally, but courage could not fill gas tanks. Their discipline remained even when hope did not. That was both their strength and their tragedy. To McCown, the lesson was simple. The Germans didn't lose at Stoumont because the Americans outfought them. They lost because the Americans outsupplied them. In war, humanity reveals itself in strange places, in a doctor using a pocket knife as a scalpel, and a soldier sharing a captured chocolate bar with his prisoner, and an officer saying, "Release the wounded," because he knows there's no medicine left. These were not acts of mercy from saints. They were the decisions of men still trying to stay human when everything around them demanded otherwise. Echoes beyond the battle. When McCown testified after the war, he remembered those faces. The young German soldier eating cold ham, the doctor with empty hands, Peiper standing over a dying offensive, still giving orders with a calm voice. He said he saw no monsters, only men caught in a machine that had run out of oil and mercy at the same time. For all the hatred that war bred, there was a strange equality in suffering. Both sides bled, both froze, both missed home. The difference was that one side still had trucks bringing hot coffee and medical supplies, while the other marched through the snow on empty stomachs. Courage kept them fighting. Logistics decided who lived long enough to remember it. By the end of December 1944, the snow-covered hills of Belgium were littered with the wreckage of a dream. The German offensive, so bold in conception, so desperate in execution, had burned itself out. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed. For Peiper's men, the collapse was literal. On Christmas Eve, the remnants of his Kampfgruppe slipped eastward through the forest, abandoning tanks, trucks, and the wounded they could not carry. Behind them lay a trail of steel. 7 Tiger IIs, 50 medium tanks, 70 half-tracks, more than 100 vehicles, all perfectly functional, all left behind because their fuel tanks were empty. They did not surrender in battle. They surrendered to physics. The cost of an empty tank. When American units recaptured the area, they found the evidence frozen in place. Panther tanks stood in fields like statues. Engines intact, ammunition ready, crews gone. One American officer wrote in his report, "It was as if the war had stopped mid-sentence." Villagers came later, climbing into the abandoned machines out of curiosity. Some of those tanks would become museum pieces. Visitors still asked the same question. Why were they left behind? The answer is always the same: no fuel. The engines that once roared across Europe now rested silent, not because of bravery or fear, but because the gas tanks were dry. From tactics to arithmetic. In January 1945, as Allied forces pushed the Germans back to their starting lines, the interrogation rooms filled with captured officers. Among them sat General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army. He was a professional soldier, respected even by his enemies, and unlike many of his peers, he did not lie to protect his pride. When American intelligence officers asked what had gone wrong, he didn't mention weather, or terrain, or even Hitler's interference. He said one word: logistics. He explained that the plan was doomed before the first shot was fired. 5 million gallons of fuel had been allocated for an operation that required 10. The offensive depended on capturing American depots, an assumption built on hope rather than planning. Some depots were destroyed. Some were defended. And some, like the great depot at Stavelot, were missed altogether. It was, he said, a strategy that relied on miracles. The collapse of a system. Manteuffel went further. He described how German logistics had been dying for years. The Eastern Front had drained everything: men, trucks, horses, railways. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was moving more supplies by horse-drawn wagon than by motor transport. A modern army waging a modern war with 19th century methods. He gave numbers. A division with 5,000 horses needed 50 tons of feed per day just to exist. That feed had to be transported over bombed roads already crowded with vehicles. Each horse that died became another burden to remove. Meanwhile, the Americans moved their supplies by truck, standardized, interchangeable, mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands. Trucks did not need to eat. They did not die in the cold. They waited, silent, until gasoline brought them to life. That difference, the distance between horses and trucks, was the distance between defeat and victory. The American way of war. While German industry crumbled under bombs, American factories worked without interruption. Detroit built tanks while Iowa grew corn. Ships carried both across an ocean untouched by enemy attack. The port of Antwerp alone handled more tonnage per month than all German ports combined. Every rifle, every uniform, every ration that reached the front was part of a machine so vast that no single soldier could see its edges. From Pennsylvania steel mills to French supply depots, it functioned like an artery system feeding a living giant. Destroy one vein, and a dozen others kept the lifeblood flowing. American logistics was not glamorous. It was not heroic in the traditional sense, but it was relentless, efficient, and adaptable, the qualities that win long wars. The illusion of willpower. German officers after the war liked to blame defeat on weather, on Hitler, on luck. But Manteuffel rejected those excuses. He said the truth plainly. Willpower cannot replace resources. An army cannot fight on courage alone. The German army in December 1944 still fought with skill, still terrified its enemies in close combat, but its strength was hollow. Behind every brave man stood an empty supply truck. Behind every Tiger tank waited a missing fuel convoy. Tactical brilliance could win a day. Industrial capacity decided the decade. The economics of survival numbers again tell the story. The United States built over 400,000 trucks during the war. Germany built 140,000. America produced 80,000 tanks. Germany produced 46,000, many more complex and fragile. In the air, the disparity was crushing. 300,000 American aircraft to 120,000 German. Even food production reflected the same gap. Germany struggled to feed its army. America fed its army, its allies, and sometimes even its prisoners. German soldiers at the Bulge gained weight in American captivity because, for the first time in months, they ate regularly. The war was a contest of systems. And systems, like armies, require nourishment. The side that could feed, fuel, and replace itself faster was destined to outlast the other. A lesson in simplicity. Peiper's missed fuel depot was not just a tactical failure, it was a metaphor. He looked for a depot that made sense to a German officer, organized, centralized, guarded. He drove past an American one that looked like chaos, fuel in cans, scattered along a road, no guards, no structures. Yet it worked. It represented the genius of American logistics, simplicity as power, abundance as armor. The same principle lived in the humble K-Ration. A waterproof box, 3 meals, 2,800 calories, small enough to fit in a pocket. In 1904 alone, America produced 1.5 million of them. Each box carried not just food, but proof of factories still running, ships still sailing, an economy unbroken by war. German soldiers who opened captured rations didn't just taste better food. They tasted industrial reality. The broader meaning. By March 1945, the German armies were retreating on every front. The Ardennes offensive had consumed their last mobile reserves without achieving anything. The same fuel that might have taken them to the Meuse now powered the American trucks chasing them east. Within weeks, the Rhine was crossed. By May, Berlin had fallen. The end came not as a single explosion, but as a slow suffocation, the inevitable result of a nation that could no longer feed its own war machine. After the war, historians would call it the victory of logistics. Not the victory of generals, or even of soldiers, but of systems, of planning, production, transportation, and sheer material endurance. It was an uncomfortable truth for those who preferred stories of heroism. But it was the truth nonetheless. The American perspective. To the American veterans who fought in the Ardennes, the memory of that winter was not one of triumph, but of endurance. They remembered the cold, the fear, the endless convoys crawling through snow to bring fuel, ammunition, and coffee to the front. They knew that every shell fired, every tank refueled, every wound treated depended on someone they would never meet, an unseen army of drivers, clerks, factory workers, and farmers. They won because their nation had learned how to sustain them. In interviews decades later, many veterans expressed quiet pride, not in the battles they fought, but in the system that never abandoned them. They trusted that supplies would come, that reinforcements would arrive, that the wounded would be evacuated. That trust was a weapon as powerful as any gun. The final lesson. Germany's defeat in the Ardennes was not a mystery of fate. It was the sum of small decisions, the missed depot, the empty trucks, the rigid command structure, the refusal to see that modern war is fought with fuel as much as with fire. For Peiper, that truth arrived too late, written on the snow behind his abandoned tanks. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge proved that wars are not won solely by men who fight, but by nations that sustain them. Factories, railways, supply ships, and ration boxes, the quiet instruments of victory. Even a simple K-ration, opened in the cold, was a declaration of capability. Strategy draws the map. Logistics decides whether you ever reach the destination. And in December 1944, the destination slipped beyond Germany's reach forever. The war ended months later, but the snow of December 1944 never truly melted from memory. For those who lived through it, Americans and Germans alike, it remained a frozen landscape of exhaustion and realization. In museums across Europe today, you can still see the relics of that winter. A Tiger II tank sitting silent under a shelter of glass. A rusted jerrycan labeled Stavelot Depot Number 2. A small brown box marked K-Ration, breakfast unit. Each object tells the same quiet story. The mightiest armies on earth reduced to waiting for fuel, for food, for warmth. The story of courage constrained by arithmetic, of ambition undone by logistics. The morning that said it all. It began with a single image. December 17th, 1944, 0800 hours. American prisoners pumping American gasoline into German tanks while their captors stood guard. It was a scene both efficient and absurd, a reflection of the entire war, the defeated fueling the desperate. Hours later, those same tanks would drive past 3 million gallons of untouched fuel, fuel that could have changed everything, and never see it. That missed moment became the hinge on which the Ardennes offensive turned. But even if Peiper had found the depot, even if his tanks had reached the Meuse, the result might have been the same. Because by then, the war was no longer about who fought harder. It was about who could keep fighting at all. The quiet triumph. For the American army, victory in the Battle of the Bulge was not won by glory or genius, but by endurance. Convoys crawled through blizzards bringing fuel to the front. Air crews flew in weather that froze their instruments. Mechanics repaired engines with numb fingers. Clerks in tents tracked thousands of shipments by hand. It was a triumph of ordinary people doing their jobs without fanfare. Farmers, factory workers, truck drivers, quartermasters. An invisible chain of effort that stretched from the forests of the Ardennes back to every small town in America. While others fought, they sustained. That too was courage. The fate of Peiper. Joachim Peiper survived the war. Captured, interrogated, tried, imprisoned, and eventually released. He lived quietly for decades, haunted by the ghosts of both victory and atrocity. When asked later about Stavelot, he admitted he had never imagined that fuel could be stored in such a way. Simple cans along a road, unguarded, efficient. He had expected order. He found nothing because he was looking for the wrong kind of order. In that irony lay the larger truth. Germany had built a war machine of precision, but not of flexibility. America had built one of abundance and adaptation. The first could win battles, the second could win wars. Peiper died in 1976 in France, under circumstances still debated. But his name lives in the footnotes of history as a symbol of brilliance consumed by a system that could no longer sustain it. What the generals learned. In 1946, when General Manteuffel lectured American officers at Fort Leavenworth, he spoke not of tactics but of logistics. He told them that Germany lost the war long before Berlin fell, lost it in the oil fields of Romania, in the bombed railways, in the frozen convoys stalled for want of gasoline. He ended his talk with a single sentence that would become a mantra in modern military academies. No plan survives without supply. His audience nodded, but they also knew something deeper. No soldier survives without someone else keeping him alive. The legacy of the K-Ration. In that winter, German soldiers opened captured K-Rations and saw more than food. They saw the industrial strength of a nation that could feed 10 million men every day, 3 times a day, across an ocean. They saw proof that the war was lost, not because they lacked bravery, but because they lacked factories, ships, oil, and time. To American soldiers, those same boxes meant something else. They meant that somewhere far away, a system was working. A factory worker they'd never meet had made sure they wouldn't go hungry. A logistics officer had made sure that a crate arrived in time. Each meal was a small reassurance that they weren't forgotten. Decades later, veterans would still remember the smell of that box, the waxed cardboard, the instant coffee, the chocolate that never melted even in a pocket. It wasn't just food. It was faith in motion. What remains today, the roads between Bullingen and Stavelot, are quiet. The villages rebuilt, the bridges repaired, the fields green again. Tourists drive where tanks once crawled, unaware that beneath the soil lie fragments of the machines that shaped history. But if you stand there in winter, when the wind cuts sharp and the sky hangs low, you can almost hear it. The echo of engines fading, the rhythm of boots on snow, the faint metallic clatter of jerry cans being passed hand to hand. For a moment, time folds. and you remember that history isn't written only by those who win, but also by those who endured. The lesson, the Battle of the Bulge, was not just the last German offensive. It was the last illusion that courage alone could outpace logistics, that daring could replace production. When it failed, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. It taught the world a simple truth: strategy may inspire, but logistics decides. An army's greatness lies not only in its soldiers, but in the hands that feed, clothe, and fuel them. That truth still echoes in every conflict since. Every convoy that reaches its destination, every medic who finds supplies waiting, every soldier who eats warm food in the field, all of them are part of that legacy. A final reflection. For the veterans who survived, the Ardennes was not a tale of glory. It was a memory of cold, exhaustion, and endurance. Of comrades lost and found. Of faith. Faith that the next truck would arrive, that the next sunrise would bring relief. And for those who came after, it stands as a quiet monument to what sustains a nation in war. Not only courage and sacrifice, but competence and care. When you visit those hills today, pause for a moment. Remember the men on both sides who fought, froze, and waited. Remember that victory was carried not only on the backs of heroes, but in the steady hands of those who kept them alive. Wars are fought by armies. They are won by the people who keep those armies standing. And in that December long ago, a cardboard box of rations and a road lined with unseen fuel told the whole story of why one side endured and the other did not.